welcome, Dr. Peters. Here we are again. We have reached phase 3, right? So
we have.
The last time we talked about this research, you had noted that the point of a phase 2 trial is not specifically to show efficacy or effectiveness, but just there's dosing questions, just safety questions, that kind of thing. And it sounds like we got enough information from our phase 2 to go to phase 3. My first question about that is there any convincing that needs to be done? So you finish phase 2 and you say, okay, we learned what we needed to learn, and now we need a green light?
Sure. Yep. Yeah, no, great question. Just a quick recap. So our last study was done in 2012. This current one that we're going to talk through was published in 2014, just to give everybody a sense of the time frame that it takes to actually walk through this. And as can be seen, demonstrated really nicely in the paper itself, there does need to be approval to move on to phase 3, and that approval comes from the FDA. If you notice, there were 2 separate phase 3 studies, and between the two, Expedition 1 and Expedition 2, they actually went back to the FDA to request a change in the endpoint to be more relevant to individuals with mild Alzheimer's diseases. They originally focused on both mild and moderate and went with the type of assessments that we do across the range of patients with dementia. Which is when they moved from Expedition 1 into Expedition 2, they started collecting a different version of the cognitive scale that's more comprehensive and it might even just be 3 more questions. But ask a few more questions that are more specific for teasing apart mild types of cognitive changes.
Obviously, we all want and hope that we find some wonderful intervention that's going to make a difference. But isn't it kind of cheating to add questions?
It feels a little bit like that. Yeah, sure. I think that these are major investments on the part of the pharmaceutical company, but also on the part of the investigators. I believe, if I'm not wrong, that the version that they did end up collecting later on that had those additional items, theoretically, you could run analyses getting rid of those items, and it would still be that initial endpoint that they had discussed.
Okay, so they didn't change so much as add a little bit.
Yeah, it does have that feel to it, though. Yes, kind of changing the game in the middle. My assumption would be that when the FDA saw it was essentially just asking a few more questions, and you still could look at that original primary endpoint, that it probably made sense to them to go ahead and make that change.
All right, so we've got double-blind trials, 1,012 and 1,040 patients, mild to moderate. Some of them are going to receive a placebo or this 400 milligrams of this dose every 4 weeks for 18 months. Now, just remind me, I'm assuming that you can give a placebo because there isn't anything else. Is that right?
Correct. Yep. So these individuals, they were still allowed to be on the established treatments. So if they were on acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, so medicines like Aricept or Exelon, they were able to stay on those medications. If they were on Namenda or Memantine, they were able to stay on that. So essentially, you're comparing standard of care in the placebo group to standard of care plus this new drug in the intervention group. If there were other great alternatives, studies like this can get fairly complicated in terms of using a placebo. And sometimes you'll have to do a study where you actually have to prove that if there is a really nice established drug, that yours is better in some way. And so the comparison group may be actually that old drug as opposed to nothing, or as opposed to a placebo. Which, to take back that word nothing, the placebo group, it is something, right? You're coming in, you're getting a treatment, you're interacting with people that care about you. And so that's what makes it so important to have that group so that you can really assess, is it the drug or is it the experience of being in the trial that has resulted in improvement or lack thereof.
So we have a similar exclusion and inclusion.
They kept it very broad. So they are including otherwise healthy patients, 55 years of age or older, who have mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease. They cannot have active depressive symptoms at the time of the study. So anybody with depression was excluded.
What were they actually measuring?
Yep. So they have both primary and secondary outcome measures. As we talked about in the phase 2 study, the primary outcomes was looking at safety, tolerability, as opposed to efficacy. In this study, we've now flipped that. So we're now looking at clinical improvement as the primary outcome, and they have selected 2 different measures to be their primary outcome measures. The acronyms get very long for these particular scales, but to make it simple, one of them is assessing cognition and the other one is assessing functioning. They've picked measures that are established, well used in the field, used within research, that look at cognition and functioning. Now, in terms of secondary measures, they again look at safety, they again look at tolerability, similar to in the phase 2 trial, and then they collect a bunch of what we call secondary outcome measures. So these are measures that oftentimes can target or be assessing the same thing as your primary outcome measures, but they're different scales. So when we're designing a study, as you can imagine, there are thousands of assessments that could be chosen. So you want to choose ones that are well established within the field, that are commonly used for these types of studies. But then, again, this is a major time and money investment. So you want to collect other assessments just to make sure that, are we missing something? So their secondary assessments, they throw in some additional cognitive screens, and they throw in some information for what are called neuropsychiatric symptoms. Those would be things like depression, anxiety, agitation. So looking at have those types of symptoms improved by being on this medication, and then some other quality of life assessments were secondary outcome measures as well. They also looked at biological markers and neuroimaging. So similar to in our phase 2 study, where they were looking at blood and CSF and imaging, they do that again here. And the goal or the idea of that would be, if they do see improvement in a particular set of people, can they line that up with changes on imaging or changes in blood biomarkers or changes in CSF? Because ultimately, when this gets out and is used, you ideally want to have some way of monitoring how the medication is working, especially in a drug or a medication where if you are influencing cognition, it may be that you're slowing decline as opposed to actually seeing an improvement in cognition. It gets hard for us to know, even with the medications that are available now for treatment. You start somebody on one like Aricept, for example, and if they tolerate it, we tend to continue it indefinitely, knowing very little about whether it's influenced that trajectory.
Figure 1 tells us that, in both of these, various people were assigned, and then a number of people dropped out. Looked to me like a fair number. I have no idea, but there's 506 of those, only 370 actually completed the study. And then over here in the second one, we've got 519 and only 400 completed the study. I was just curious if that's a concern or whether that's what is to be expected with people who are facing a serious health problem.
That's another reason why the placebo group is included, to try to take a look at, is there a difference in dropout rates between the 2 groups? And in this study, the rates are essentially the same. I mean, it's actually, for the Expedition 1, it was the exact same number of people, which is not easy to do. And you see the list of reasons why, and they were largely comparable. So I think the most important takeaway to learn from this is that you have this attrition in studies, and it happens, especially when something is running over the course of 18 months, which is, and that just includes the time period of actively receiving the drug. There's all the recruitment and education on the front end, getting things started. So, you're asking for a significant time commitment from people. And oftentimes, if they're not noticing a difference or they're not feeling better, and very rarely will participants say, that's the reason why they're leaving. But we do notice as a whole in trials where there is significant improvement, people tend to do a better job of finishing it and executing the entire study. Also, a key thing to note is the difference when we have now moved to something that is 18 months long, the completion rates in these studies versus in that phase 2 study, where it was a very high completion rate of people that finished it. It might have even been close to 100%, if I'm not misremembering, in that phase 2 study, which was much shorter than something that's 18 months long.
So in here, it talks, a couple of the tables refer to intention to treat. Can you just describe what that means?
Yeah, so intention to treat, the idea is that when people are not finishing a study, when they're not able to get all the way through it for one reason or another, you oftentimes will continue to use their data that they have contributed to the study, and you use their data in a way that they are still left in the group for that treatment that they were supposed to receive. So if your intent was to treat that person with solanezumab, then they're going to be, from a data stat standpoint, included in that group of people, and vice versa for the individuals in the control group. There are different ways of handling that data. So, let's say that somebody got through 6 months of the study, but didn't finish the remaining year. Oftentimes you'll use the data that you have from their last visit, from that 6-month visit, and treat it like it is the outcome at the 18-month point. Oftentimes study teams will run the analyses both with completers, people that have gotten all the way through, as well as including everybody, including those people that did not finish.
So there were adverse events during the study treatment, but the placebo looks pretty similar.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see anything of concern in terms of adverse events?
I don't mean this to sound negative, but if you really are using a drug that is going to get into the brain and rip out all of that amyloid, you might expect that you would see more adverse events in the treatment group. And those are the types of adverse events that you counsel people on, and you sometimes determine there's an acceptable risk. Just like any type of surgery, for example, there's always a risk, and the individual decides that it's an acceptable risk. Studies that are using medicines that we know could be doing something more intense, like taking amyloid out of the brain, you'd almost expect there to be a few more adverse events. Not that we want that. So equally similar, does that mean that the drug is completely safe, or does that mean that it's not doing much more in the brain than placebo is? And so it kind of goes both directions. We never want people to have side effects, but sometimes side effects let us know that the medication is actually getting into their system and doing something.
Right. Do you agree that the way that they designed this, it sounds like it made sense?
This is just a group of truly expert investigators doing the right things, trying their best to stick to primary outcome measures. Yeah, I believe that they designed it in an appropriate way. I believe that they interpreted the results in a very conservative, appropriate way. Part of why I like showing these, I'm really impressed with the scientific rigor that the team brought to this, and the scientific rigor that the pharmaceutical company helped us support.
The good news is that they did this great science, and the bad news is it didn't work.
Correct. Yep. So, and I made this pessimistic comment on the last one too, that, sometimes, especially for these types of anti-amyloid drugs that have consistently been difficult to show effect, sometimes when the study is negative, you're more likely to believe the results, which is just is what it is. But in this study, both Expedition 1 and Expedition 2, primary outcome measures were negative. In Expedition 2, they got a little bit closer to the cognitive scale, showing significance, but it didn't meet their own cut point for what they meant by significance. They did a number of analyses where they compared or looked at individually mild Alzheimer's disease and moderate Alzheimer's disease. In general, they saw more improvement, or put another way, a slowing of the trajectory of decline in people with mild versus moderate disease, especially in that first Expedition 1, which is what led them to make some changes in Expedition 2. But even though it seemed to be better in mild disease, it still didn't come or reach that point of being significant. Looking at all of the secondary outcome measures, there were a few that were positive. So the mini mental state examination, which is a measure of cognition, favored solanezumab in Expedition 2. And then in Expedition 2, when they looked at mild disease only, they found some favoring results towards solanezumab for one of the other measures of what are called activities of daily living, which is another way to look at functioning. They did see that in some of the secondary measures, but those were not the primary measures, which means that the FDA wouldn't use them. And same thing, the study team doesn't overplay that they found that stuff, which I think is really important. They do go on to do future work with this medication where they kind of move towards people with less severe disease. So they did future studies, but they didn't try to spin this study in a way. They actually they saw a signal and went to do more research because of that, which is the right way to do it.
Right. But I have a question about that. So we did a phase 2 and there was some theory to believe this might help. We did a phase 3 and the evidence suggested no. Isn't that the end of the story?
Oftentimes not, right? So if you think of the pipeline of how these things develop and the commitment that the pharmaceutical company specifically makes to developing this medication, if there's a signal there towards people with more mild disease benefiting, they often will chase that down in some way. And I'm sure that they have a bunch of calculations on their end to decide whether it's worth it or not. To me, as long as we are properly educating potential participants about the prior work that has been done and the state of the literature at the time that they're being enrolled in these studies, part of science is using your established studies to guide the next one.
If this data was exactly the same, except it was about athlete's foot. I mean, matters. We've all had it. But nothing compared to the terror, the pain, the difficulties of managing Alzheimer's disease. If the data were the same, would they keep going?
Yeah, that's a great way of framing it. Probably not, right? There's other treatments that exist for that. It is these disease states where we're struggling to find anything to help slow them down, to help curb what we're seeing, especially in the setting of a population that it's a good thing is living longer. But this is a wave of individuals with this disease that we really don't have great treatments to offer them. The FDA in another disease state might also say, heck no, you're not doing another clinical trial for that. In the case of Alzheimer's disease, often do approve the next one. Like, oh, you're going to look at more mild disease. Well, that kind of is the way the state of the field is going. Okay, we're going to approve another trial. Yeah, I think the whole system, from the pharmaceutical companies to the investigators to the FDA, are clamoring for something to help these people, which is why you keep seeing the approvals coming through.
The other sort of take-home lessons from this?
I think the take-home lessons, a very important one, is that our phase 2 study, in addition to showing safety and tolerability, if the group remembers, it also showed that the drug was doing what they thought it was supposed to do. It was moving it from the brain, out into the systemic circulations. First takeaway is, just because the drug is doing what you want it to do or you think it should do, this is a very clear display of how that may not translate into clinical improvement. So you go through all that process of designing something to do what you want it to, it successfully does that. And then that still doesn't mean that you're going to have the impact or the effect that you are going to have. I think the second takeaway from this is that it again points towards the fact that amyloid and changing levels of amyloid is only one part of the story when it comes to Alzheimer's disease and how it progresses or how it changes the brain. And then I think the third takeaway that I'll throw out there is that, they conclude in their paper in terms of future directions that they want to look at potentially more closely at people with mild Alzheimer's disease or asymptomatic disease with positive biomarkers is how they phrase it. It's a very real world example of the movement towards more mild disease, which ultimately for some of the more recent anti-amyloid drugs, including the one that was FDA approved, that's the group that it honed in on, was people with mild disease. You're not going to see trials of these types of drugs in people with moderate to severe disease. They're just not going to be included because we've done enough studies to show you got to catch it earlier in these people, which is disheartening to people that are in the moderate to severe stages of things.
Yeah. Is there any reason that is focusing on those people who are already experiencing moderate to severe?
There's been studies of the literature looking at development of drugs targeting cognition in people with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease versus development of drugs that are symptom targeted. So the things like agitation, depression, anxiety, etc., they're complete inverse correlation. There's a complete dive in the number of studies looking at cognitive enhancement in people with moderate to severe disease, and a huge uptick in studies looking at symptomatic management. So I think what you're seeing is this acceptance that these folks, when they're mild to moderate, they have the disease and you're managing presentations of that disease, as opposed to trying to target what's causing it to begin with. Symptom management is really what's been transitioned for those more severe cases.
All right. Well, I'm sure that our folks will have many more questions about it, but I think we have covered this article. So thank you so very much for your time again. And I very much look forward to continuing this conversation with our Talk Nerdy participants.
Thank you. Me as well, Sarah. It's always great to talk.